Rain slicked the stones of London's Western Road as dawn bled a wan grey across the sky. Already the crowd had gathered, breath steaming in the chill, the smell of damp wool and roasted chestnuts mingling with the iron tang of anticipation. Children were hoisted onto shoulders, vendors shouted over one another, and all eyes fixed on the wooden scaffold rising above the Tyburn mud. The rope swayed like a pendulum, a silent promise that the day would end with death. When the condemned finally emerged, 2 thieves and a woman accused of poisoning her master, the crowd surged forward, hungry for spectacle. A murmur spread as the hangman tested the knot. Boots scraped the boards, prayers faltered. Then the trap snapped and the air filled with a single, collective gasp. Some cheered. Others looked away. Above them, the rope creaked in the drizzle like a warning the city had long ago learned to ignore. London's appetite for punishment did not end at the gallows. In narrow lanes behind the churches, ironwork gleamed where the scolds' bridles hung, waiting. Women accused of quarreling too loudly, of gossip or witchcraft, were dragged through jeering streets and forced to kneel as the cold steel cage clamped around their heads. Its sharp bit pressed down on the tongue so no word could form, only muffled whimpers that fogged the air. The onlookers, merchants, apprentices, even children clutching sweetmeats, gawked as if the pain itself were a sermon. Some women were strapped to long benches and ducked again and again into the river, icy water closing over their faces until limbs thrashed weakly and the crowd laughed at the choking sputter when they surfaced. Justice, they called it, though it reeked of sport. Then came the year when justice drowned beneath the plague. Summer heat baked the alleys until the stench of rot became a living thing. Rats scurried like spilled ink through markets, their slick tails disappearing beneath doors nailed shut from the outside. Watchmen daubed crimson crosses on infected houses and hammered the final boards as families screamed from within. At night, the city lay under a muffled hush broken only by the rumble of dead carts and the mournful call of "Bring out your dead." Mothers laid fevered children on doorsteps in hopes a stranger might carry them to safety. Priests whispered last rites through cracks in the walls. By winter, whole parishes stood empty, windows black and silent, as if London itself were holding its breath. Amid the pestilence, fear of the unseen grew sharper than any knife. Whispers of witchcraft crept through taverns and pulpits alike. Ministers thundered of God's wrath, neighbors eyed one another with sudden suspicion. Secret tribunals bloomed like mold in the dark, where men in black robes demanded confessions no one could truly give. Catholics were dragged from hiding places beneath stairwells, Puritans accused of heresy by rivals, and the innocent learned that silence was as deadly as defiance. A single complaint, a passing grudge, could summon the constable's knock before dawn. It was in such a season that Eleanor Gray, a midwife known for her steady hands and quiet kindness, found herself summoned to the magistrate's chamber. A nobleman's child had been stillborn, the grieving family sought someone to blame. By candlelight they questioned her, their voices polite yet edged like razors. She answered calmly, spoke of fever and misfortune, but their eyes gleamed with the certainty of those who have already chosen a culprit. At dawn she was led through streets slick with last night's rain, her wrists bound, neighbors pressing close to glimpse the shame of a woman they had once trusted with their infants. The square smelled of wet earth and smoke. The iron bridle waited, its cruel bit catching the light like a shard of moon. They forced her to her knees. Metal scraped teeth as the cage slid over her head, the bar wedging against her tongue until her breath came in ragged sobs. The crowd muttered, some with curiosity, some with uneasy pity. A child reached for his mother's hand and asked why the healer must wear a mask meant for devils. No one answered. Eleanor's eyes, gray as wintertide, swept the faces before her. She did not plead. She did not weep. Even when the bailiff turned the screw to tighten the band beneath her jaw, she held herself like a figure carved from stone. Minutes stretched like hours. The rain returned, soft as breath, beating on the iron until it gleamed black. Slowly the restless jeers dwindled to silence. One by one, heads lowered. In the hush, the only sound was the drip of water from the scaffold eaves and the faint creak of the bridle as she shifted her weight. Something passed through the crowd, an understanding too late to matter, that no sorcery dwelled in this woman, only a quiet courage that exposed their own cruelty. The magistrate cleared his throat, uneasy. A bell tolled in the distance, and the gathering began to dissolve, shame clinging like the damp. When at last they unlocked the cage, Eleanor collapsed without a word. By nightfall she had vanished into the warren of alleys near the river, leaving behind only the echo of her restrained breaths. Search parties scoured the city for days, but no body was ever found. Some said she fled to the countryside. Others swore she walked straight into the Thames and the current carried her to the sea. Children whispered that she had taken to the air like a ghost, free of the earth that betrayed her. Weeks later, the plague claimed the magistrate who ordered her punishment. His name was recorded carefully in the parish ledger. Of Eleanor Gray there is no entry, no burial note, no mark of existence beyond the memory of those who witnessed her silent defiance. The wind still threads through the empty lanes where she once walked, carrying a faint metallic tang, as if the city itself remembers. And not a single parish record dares speak her name. Snow fell in dry, whispering flakes, settling over the crooked rooftops of Salem Village as though the night itself sought to smother the fever burning in its heart. Beneath the eaves of the meeting house, lanterns guttered in the wind, their light trembling across faces pinched with cold and suspicion. The scent of wood smoke mingled with something sour, fear so thick it seemed to rise from the frozen earth. Across the Atlantic, England's plague years were fading into memory, yet the same dread of unseen devils had sailed with the settlers and rooted itself in the New World's soil. The old cruelty merely changed its accent. It began, as such madness often does, with children. In January, the minister's niece and her friend collapsed in fits, limbs twisting, eyes rolled white as milk. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of witches' marks and spectral pinches. When the girls whispered names through their convulsions, the village listened. Pettiness and buried grudges bloomed like frost flowers, a quarrel over a boundary fence, a dispute about a missing kettle, the memory of an unpaid debt. Each small spite hardened into accusation until the list of the damned lengthened faster than the day's brief light could fade. The court sat in a drafty wooden hall where judges wore black and scripture was wielded like a blade. Dreams and visions were treated as proof, the testimony of a child carried the weight of the 10 Commandments. Men who once shared cider at the tavern now stood as witnesses for the gallows, their words sharpened by envy or fear. Women were stripped of dignity with a single sentence. Hemp ropes were knotted while the accused still breathed the chill of midnight. Among them was Margaret Hale, a healer whose hands had delivered half the village's children and eased countless fevers with herbs gathered from the salt marsh. Widowhood had left her solitary, a figure easy to resent. When the minister's niece claimed Margaret's spectre sat upon her chest at night, the constables came before dawn. They found her grinding willow bark, the pestle pausing mid-turn as she looked up, calm as the first snow. She did not resist when they bound her wrists, resistance would only feed their story. The jail was little more than a timbered shed near the harbor, its air rank with damp straw and unwashed bodies. Chains bit into her skin as she sat through the endless hours, the sea's winter roar muffled by heavy planks. She heard other prisoners weeping, prayers tumbling from their lips in frantic whispers. Margaret prayed too, but quietly, words of her own making that asked not for mercy from men but for the courage to meet what lay ahead. On the morning of her trial, frost rimed the windows in delicate feathers. The guards led her through streets hushed except for the crunch of boots on snow. Villagers leaned from doorways, eyes sharp with curiosity, some clutching their children as if her passing might infect them. Inside the courthouse, the fire smoked and sputtered. Witnesses spoke of spectral claws, of voices in the dark calling them to sin. Margaret met each claim with steady silence. When asked if she consorted with the devil, she lifted her gaze and said only, "I serve no master but God, and he knows me." The judges frowned, for such calm was more dangerous than rage. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. By dusk she was returned to the cell, a rope already set aside for mourning. That final night, moonlight pooled across the stone floor like frozen milk. She traced its edge with her fingertip and thought of her daughter lost to fever years before, of the husband buried beneath English earth. The ocean had carried her to this supposed sanctuary, and now it would carry her away, though not in any ship she had imagined. Before dawn the guards unbarred the door. A brittle wind knifed through the village as she was led to Gallows Hill. The sky burned a pale violet, the sun still a rumor beyond the trees. People gathered in a ring, boots stamping against the cold. The rope swung gently from the wooden frame, a mute pendulum counting down the final moments of her life. Margaret climbed the ladder without falter, her skirts brushing frost from the rungs. She looked once toward the harbor where the Atlantic glimmered like beaten pewter and allowed herself a single breath of salt air. The hangman tightened the knot. Someone in the crowd began a hymn, the notes wavering as if the melody itself feared the wind. Margaret's lips moved in a prayer no one could hear. When the trap gave way, a gust of snow lifted around her like a shroud, and the hymn died on every tongue. In the weeks that followed, her small cottage was seized by neighbors who claimed it for unpaid debts. Her herb jars were smashed, her few letters burned to ash in the hearth. The records of her trial vanished from the town ledger as though she had never lived. Children played in the empty garden, their laughter carried off by the sea breeze. Only the earth beneath the gallows kept her name, and it spoke in silence. Years later, when the frenzy cooled and apologies were muttered in dusty meeting houses, the graves of the executed remained unmarked. Families who dared to remember were fined into silence. Travelers who paused on the hill at dusk swore the air tasted of iron and salt, as if the ocean itself mourned what the village had done. Even now, when the tide turns and the winter wind sweeps through Salem, some claim they hear the faint rasp of a rope and a woman's quiet breath carried across the water. The Atlantic carried their screams back to England, but the sea keeps the truth.